Hello. Today I'd like to read Class Confusion, SpongeBob SquarePants. It's by Sarah Wilson, illustrated by Robert Dress. SpongeBob, look out! Shrieked Mrs. Puff, but it was too late. Screech, crash, boom, boom, boom. Oops, sorry, Mrs. Puff, said SpongeBob. I guess I forgot to put my blinker on. Looks like I failed my boating test again. I'm calling in sick tomorrow, Mrs. Puff muttered. I need a little me time. The next day, SpongeBob arrived early for a boating school, and as usual, he breathed as in deeply as he entered the front doors. Behold, the halls of learning, he said to himself. And here's the fountain of learning which I drink from every day. He took a sip from the drinking fountain and continued down the hall. At the classroom door, SpongeBob's voice quavered, and inside that room is the one who makes it all happen. Slowly he pushed open the door. Yes, indeed, inside this room was my teacher, the one and only Mrs. Ah! Mrs. Puff was not at her desk. Instead, there was a substitute. Where's Mrs. Puff? SpongeBob finally asked. The substitute did not even look up from the magazine he was reading. Out today, he said, turning a page. Have a seat. SpongeBob sank heavily into his chair. Psst, said a voice next to him. It was Horace. I have a really funny idea, whispered Horace. Let's play a trick on the sub. I'll pretend to be you, and you pretend to be me, okay? It'll be hilarious, Horace said, snickering. I guess so, said SpongeBob. He didn't really mind. The substitute stood up. He was holding a clipboard. Time to take attendance, he said. Susie? Here, said Susie. Franco? Here, said Franco. SpongeBob? Here, yelled Horace before SpongeBob could say anything. Horace? There was a pause. Is Horace here today? SpongeBob felt a poke in his ribs. Yeah, here, said SpongeBob, as Horace snickered some more. The substitute began passing out pieces of paper. Today you're supposed to take a test, he said. Everyone groaned, except SpongeBob, whose eyes shone with excitement. A test. Don't forget to write your names at the top, said the substitute before sitting back down at his desk. Psst, whispered Horace to SpongeBob. Horace pointed to his own test where he had written the name SpongeBob. Then Horace pointed at SpongeBob's paper. SpongeBob wrote Horace at the top of his test. After the test, the substitute told the class, okay, now, open your manuals and read or something. SpongeBob's hands shot up. Mrs. Puff usually reviews the homework with us, and then after that she teaches us the lesson of the day, and whoever has the most class participation, usually me, gets to stay after school and clap the erasers. The substitute blinked at SpongeBob. Is that right? He looked down at his clipboard. Horace? Well, I do things a bit differently. But you just reminded me. Your teacher left me a list of students who are to stay after school for extra help. He glanced at a sheet of paper. Oh, just one student. That would be you, SpongeBob, as he pointed at Horace. Horace looked over at SpongeBob and winked. After school, SpongeBob walked home very slowly. Hey, SpongeBob, called Patrick. Why the sad face? Mrs. Puff wasn't at school today, SpongeBob began. And there was a sub who didn't do anything the right way, and I was supposed to stay after school for extra help, but Horace was pretending to be me, so he got to stay, and SpongeBob burst into tears. Patrick patted his friend on the back. Don't worry, SpongeBob, he said. I'm sure Mrs. Puff will be back tomorrow, and everything will be back to normal. You'll be failing another driving test before you know it. I hope so, SpongeBob said, sniffling. The next day, SpongeBob held his breath as he entered the classroom. There, sitting at her desk, was his beloved Mrs. Puff. She was looking well rested. Oh, Mrs. Puff, gushed SpongeBob. I'm sure glad to see you. Mrs. Puff smiled. Yes, I feel very refreshed after my sick day, she said. Mrs. Puff, the sub forgot to give us homework, even though I reminded him 3 times. said SpongeBob. But Mrs. Puff wasn't listening. She was staring at a note. It seems to me the substitute gave you all the final exam by mistake, and instead of keeping one student after school for extra help, he sent that student to retake his driving test. All the color suddenly drained from her face, and that student passed his driving test. Who was the student? Franco asked. Mrs. Puff paused before announcing. It was SpongeBob. Everyone gasped. SpongeBob had passed his driving test at last. I passed at last, SpongeBob yelled to everyone as he walked home, even though he didn't remember taking the test again. Hey, no more school, SpongeBob, said Patrick. We can play all day. SpongeBob grinned. Yeah, that's great, Patrick. No more homework, no more school, no more Mrs. Puff? Suddenly he realized what that meant. Oh no, he wailed. The next day, SpongeBob forgot about Mrs. Puff for a while. He was too excited to get behind the wheel of a boat all by himself. I'm ready, he shouted. A small crowd had gathered to watch SpongeBob drive alone for the first time. He rented a limited edition Halibut GXT for his special occasion. Even Mrs. Puff was there. I just don't understand it, said Mrs. Puff to herself. How did he manage to pass his driving test? It's time for me to move far away. I don't want to be around when SpongeBob is driving. Vroom! SpongeBob revved up the engine. Then he noticed his teacher standing nearby. His heart grew heavy. He started to tear up. Even though I'm really glad I finally got my license, I sure am going to miss being in your class, Mrs. Puff, he said. Goodbye, Mrs. Puff. SpongeBob stepped on the gas pedal and the boat flew forward and screeched to a halt in the middle of the intersection. Suddenly a siren wailed and the police cruiser zoomed up. 2 officers hopped out. Hey, you didn't stop at that stop sign, said one officer. License, please. Yes, sir, officer, SpongeBob replied. Here it is, brand new and never used. The officer studied the license. There seems to be a problem, he said. You passed the driving portion of your boating test, but you failed the written exam. SpongeBob looked at the test the officer was holding up. Of course, it was a test that Horace had taken pretending to be SpongeBob, and Horace had failed. Horace must have passed the driving test while pretending to be SpongeBob. I'm afraid you'll have to go back to boating school, the officer said. SpongeBob started to sob. Even Mrs. Puff felt bad. Oh, don't cry, SpongeBob, said Mrs. Puff. You'll get your license one day. No, Mrs. Puff, said SpongeBob. I'm crying because I'm so happy. I thought I'd never see you again, and he leaped out of the boat into the arms of his startled teacher. I need a vacation, moaned Mrs. Puff softly.